It started like many young love stories do. Quiet moments shared behind closed doors, sweet text messages sent back and forth, and the feeling that someone finally really sees you. Shemaya Nair Allen was just 18 years old, stepping into adulthood with dreams, energy, and a spark that lit up every room she walked into. She was young, full of life, and she had her whole future ahead of her. But that future was cut short, brutally and senselessly, by the man who claimed to love her. His name was Brian Jackson. At 34, he was nearly twice Shemaya's age. To some, their relationship was questionable. To others, it was downright alarming. The signs were there. The age gap, the control, the quiet withdrawal from friends. But Shemaya, like so many young women in toxic relationships, stayed, hoping love would soften the rough edges. She believed he could change. She believed he cared. But what began as affection turned into obsession. Friends started noticing the changes. Shemaya became more distant. Her usual brightness dimmed. Those closest to her worried silently, unsure how to step in. They say hindsight is always 20/20, but in this case, the warning signs weren't just subtle whispers, they were loud and visible. Still, no one could have imagined the tragedy that was coming. On that night, everything came to a devastating end. It wasn't just another argument. It was rage. It was violence. And it was fatal. In a moment that still haunts her family and community, Brian Jackson did the unthinkable. In a space that should have been safe, Shemaya was murdered, allegedly by the very person she trusted most. The news rocked those who knew her. Her name quickly spread through social media feeds, followed by hashtags, tributes, and cries for justice. Shemaya didn't deserve this, they said. She was just a baby. And she was just 18, still figuring out life, still dreaming, still believing in love. What made it even harder to accept was how familiar this story felt. Another young black woman. Another violent man. Another life stolen. Her death became more than a headline. It became a warning. A painful, heartbreaking reminder that love should never hurt, and age gaps can hide deep power imbalances. Brian Jackson didn't just take a life that night. He shattered a family, left a mother broken, and ripped a hole through a community. And now, as the legal system begins to move, questions remain. How did this happen? Why didn't anyone stop it? Could Shemaya still be alive today if someone had? In telling this story, we don't just remember Shemaya as a victim. We honor her as a daughter, a friend, a young woman who deserved safety, respect, and real love. Her life mattered. Her voice mattered. And though it was silenced far too soon, it still echoes today. Through every mother who now holds her child a little tighter, through every teen who reconsiders a controlling relationship. This isn't just a story of tragedy. It's a story that demands we pay attention. That we look out for our sisters, our daughters, our friends. That we speak up when something doesn't feel right. Because if Shemaya's story can save even one life, her light will continue to shine. And so this is her story. The real story. Of love, danger, silence, and heartbreak. Of Shemaya Nair Allen. And the man who took everything from her. Shemaya Nair Allen was the kind of girl who made you smile just by walking into the room. She had a quiet confidence about her. A mix of innocence and boldness that showed she was still discovering who she wanted to be in the world. She was 18, full of life, and like many girls her age, she was just beginning to stretch her wings. Whether she was sharing laughs with friends, making videos on her phone, or just enjoying the simple joy of being young, Shemaya was living a life full of promise. She came from a family that loved her deeply. Her mother, her siblings, those closest to her knew her heart. They knew her dreams, her quirks, and her softness. They also knew that she deserved nothing but love, protection, and respect. As a young black woman growing up in a world that can be harsh and unforgiving, that kind of support mattered. And they gave it to her. But even the strongest families can miss the subtle signs when someone they love is being pulled into danger. Enter Brian Jackson, a man who, at 34 years old, had lived an entirely different life. He was more than twice Shemaya's age when their paths crossed. How they met isn't fully known. Some say through mutual circles, others say online. But what's clear is that their relationship began while Shemaiah was still just a teenager, a girl navigating her way through life. And Brian was a grown man, with a wife, children, and a life already built. That right there was the first red flag. A married man, already tied to a family, starting a relationship with a young girl still figuring out her future. The imbalance in power, age, and life experience created a dynamic that was more than inappropriate. It was predatory. But often, these things don't look like danger at first. They show up in small ways. The flattering attention, the gifts, the affection that feels exciting and new. For Shemaiah, it may have felt like love, intense, forbidden, maybe even special. But for Brian, many now believe it was about control. Friends noticed he always seemed to be hovering in the background. He'd show up unannounced, question her about who she was with, what she was doing. First it looked like concern, but soon it began to feel like surveillance. As their relationship grew, Shemaiah started to drift from her usual routines. She wasn't as social. She was more private. Those closest to her noticed the change, but like many young women caught in toxic relationships, she didn't open up fully. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she hoped things would get better. Or maybe, like so many, she didn't yet know how bad things had gotten. Brian's life, on the other hand, was far more complicated than he let on. According to reports, he had a wife and children. And yet, he carried on with Shemaiah, secretly, possessively, dangerously. It's unclear if his wife knew the full extent of his actions, but what's known is that Brian was living a double life. And that duality, of family man on one side and jealous lover on the other, would become part of what made this story so chilling. There were moments, according to friends, when Shemaiah tried to pull away. She wanted out. But Brian wasn't the kind of man who let go easily. He clung harder, pulled more, watched more, controlled more. These are the warning signs of emotional abuse, of a man who believes if he can't have you, no one can. It's in these moments that the danger becomes very real. What once looked like intense love now feels suffocating. What once felt like protection now feels like a trap. But by the time most victims realize the full weight of the danger they're in, it's often too late. That's the heartbreaking truth about abusive relationships, especially when they involve young, impressionable women and much older, manipulative men. This is the background of the two people at the center of this tragedy. A young girl who still believed in love, and a grown man who crossed boundaries that never should have been crossed. Their relationship wasn't just flawed, it was fatal. And everything that followed was set in motion by that imbalance of power and the silence that surrounded it. At the heart of it all, Shemaiah believed she was in love. And that's what makes stories like this so painful, because when you're young and in love, you want to believe the best in someone. You want to believe that even when things feel off, they'll get better. That if you're patient, if you love hard enough, they'll treat you the way you deserve. But love isn't supposed to confuse you. It's not supposed to make you shrink. And for Shemaiah, that's exactly what began to happen. In the beginning, Brian came across as attentive, even romantic. He knew how to say all the right things. He played the role of protector, provider, someone who understood her in a way others didn't. And for a girl like Shemaiah, that kind of attention from an older man might have felt validating, maybe even exciting. But there's a dangerous difference between affection and obsession. And that line was crossed early on. Those closest to Shemaiah began to notice how deeply Brian had inserted himself into her life. He always seemed to be around. He wanted to know who she was with, what she was doing, where she was going. And if she didn't respond quickly enough, he'd show up. Call non-stop. Send message after message. What some might mistake as caring too much was really a need to control. Control masked as concern. That's how it often starts. Comment here. Question there. Why are you wearing that? Who are you texting? Don't hang with them anymore. They don't really care about you. And slowly, that control begins to isolate the victim. Friends fade away. Independence disappears. And all that's left is the relationship, and the person who controls it. Shemaiah wasn't blind to this. Deep down, she must have known something wasn't right. There were moments, small ones, where she hinted to friends that things weren't okay. But when someone has power over you, emotionally, mentally, and sometimes even physically, it can feel impossible to walk away. And the fear of what might happen if you do is enough to keep you stuck. Brian had a temper. That much became clear. And though there may not have been visible bruises early on, emotional abuse leaves its own kind of wounds, ones that don't show up on skin, but live in the way someone second-guesses their worth. Brian's jealousy grew more intense over time. He didn't want Shemaiah talking to other men. He didn't want her going out. He wanted her to belong to him, and only him. This wasn't love. It was possession. But when you're in the middle of it, especially at 18, it's hard to see the difference. You tell yourself it's passion. You convince yourself that maybe this is just how love is supposed to feel. And because Brian was older, more experienced, more dominant, his word often overpowered hers. People around her saw glimpses of the toxicity. But relationships like this don't always show their ugliest side in public. Behind closed doors, the truth can be much darker. And Shemaiah, young and trusting, may have hoped that if she just loved him a little harder, if she just stayed quiet, things would eventually calm down. But abusers don't calm down. They escalate. The more Brian felt he was losing control, the more tightly he tried to hold on. And eventually, that desperation reached a boiling point. The relationship that started with whispers of love ended with violence, because for Brian, if he couldn't have Shemaiah, no one else would. That's the devastating pattern we've seen far too many times. Love that begins with flattery, grows into control, and ends in tragedy. And Shemaiah, like so many young women, didn't deserve any of it. She deserved safety. She deserved space to grow, to learn, to love and be loved the right way. But instead, she got a man who mistook ownership for affection, and that mistake cost her everything. As time went on, the cracks in the relationship between Shemaiah and Brian grew wider. What may have started as subtle signs of control slowly turned into open displays of dominance. Friends described how Shemaiah seemed more anxious, less present, and less like the vibrant girl they once knew. The brightness in her eyes had dimmed, and the carefree joy she used to carry with her began to fade. Brian's behavior became more erratic. He didn't just want to know where Shemaiah was. He wanted to be in control of her every move. It wasn't just phone calls anymore. It was unannounced pop-ups, constant check-ins, social media monitoring. Any interaction she had with another man, whether a friend, a classmate, or even a relative, was enough to trigger suspicion or anger. Brian wasn't just jealous. He was obsessed. Behind closed doors, the emotional manipulation deepened. There were threats, small at first, then louder, more dangerous. "You're mine. If I can't have you, nobody will." These kinds of words aren't love, they're warnings. And Shemaiah, though strong and smart, was still just 18. Navigating the twisted maze of control and fear at that age is nearly impossible without help. At some point, the fear started to seep into her daily life. According to accounts, Shemaiah had confided in at least one friend about wanting to leave the relationship. She knew things weren't right. She wanted out. But leaving an abuser is the most dangerous part of any toxic relationship, and she may have known that too. Every time she pulled away, Brian pulled her back in, harder, more aggressively. The emotional strain was taking a toll on her spirit. Her family may not have known all the details, but they could feel something wasn't right. Her social media presence grew more guarded. Her messages to friends were sometimes vague, hinting at problems but never saying too much. And that silence, that protective, fearful silence, is all too common in young women caught in cycles of abuse. As Brian's control slipped, his behavior escalated. There were arguments, loud, volatile ones. Neighbors may have heard them. Friends may have seen the aftermath. But Brian knew how to keep up appearances. Abusers often do. They'll smile in front of others, pretend things are fine, only to unleash their rage when no one's watching. That's where the real danger lives, in the shadows of what no one sees. We may never know the full extent of what Shemaiah endured. But what's clear is that the situation had become volatile. Brian had become unpredictable. And the emotional abuse had reached a dangerous boiling point. For men like him, the fear of losing control often leads to catastrophic choices. When the victim finally chooses herself, the abuser feels like he's losing everything, even if he was never entitled to her in the first place. Reports suggest that in the days leading up to her death, things had gotten worse. Tensions were high. Brian may have sensed that Shemaiah was preparing to walk away for good. And that's when his obsession reached its most dangerous peak. Because when control is all someone knows, the idea of losing it becomes unbearable. And often that's when violence strikes. Shemaiah was likely trying to find a way out. Quietly, carefully. But she was dealing with a man who had shown time and time again that he wasn't willing to let go peacefully. The signs were there. The rage, the possessiveness, the threats. And on that tragic day, all of it came to a head in the most devastating way. This wasn't a sudden act. It was a slow, steady unraveling of control, fear, and emotional manipulation. A pattern that escalated over time. A relationship that had long since crossed the line. And in the end, Shemaiah didn't just lose her freedom, she lost her life. A life that should have been protected and celebrated, not destroyed. It was supposed to be just another ordinary day. The kind of day where life quietly moves forward. Messages sent, music playing, maybe plans being made. But on that day something shifted. And by the time it was over, the world had lost Shemaiah Nyer Allen in the most senseless, heartbreaking way. Details of the exact sequence are still being pieced together, but what we do know is chilling. Brian Jackson, the man who had claimed to love her, became her killer. In the privacy of a space that should have been safe. His obsession turned to violence. Whatever argument happened that day, whatever words were exchanged, none of it could justify what came next. Brian didn't just lash out in anger. He acted with finality. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate choice to end a life. A young life. An innocent life. The kind of life that had barely begun. And the cruelty of it wasn't just in the act itself, but in the betrayal, that she was taken by someone who once held her hand, called her baby, and promised to protect her. The violence was shocking, even for those who had sensed things weren't right. There was no turning back, no moment of pause or mercy. When Shemaiah was found, the reality was unbearable. She had been taken from this world far too soon. Her body now a reflection of the pain she never fully voiced. Law enforcement arrived swiftly, responding to what had become a tragic scene. Neighbors were in disbelief. Friends were broken. Family members shattered. The kind of grief that follows a death like this is not quiet. It's loud. It screams in the hearts of everyone who loved her. A mother's cry. A sister's silence. A community's outrage. Brian was arrested shortly after. There was no running from what he had done. The man who had once whispered sweet nothings into her ear now sat in handcuffs, facing the weight of the law, but no punishment could match the pain he caused. Because while the justice system may deliver a sentence, it can never bring Shemaiah back. People often ask, what was the final straw? What pushed him to kill her? The truth is, abusers don't need a reason. It could have been her wanting to leave. A simple refusal to answer his call. Boundary set. Anything that made him feel like he was losing control. And that's the terrifying part. When control is their oxygen, any sign of independence feels like a threat. For Shemaiah, that day was the ending of her life. But it was also the end of a long, invisible battle. A battle for her voice. A battle to be free. A battle to love and be loved without fear. That battle ended in violence. But it wasn't her fault. Never was. And it's important the world never forgets that. In the days that followed, candles were lit. Photos were shared. Tributes poured in. A community came together, united in grief and rage. Her name was spoken with reverence, Shemaiah. Young. Beautiful. And while her physical voice was silenced, her story began to speak for others like her. girls trapped in dangerous relationships, girls afraid to leave, girls who think, maybe he'll change. This was not just a crime. It was a loss that echoes far beyond a police report or a courtroom. It was the ending of a life that mattered. Daughter, sister, friend. Shemaiah deserved to grow old, to heal, to love someone who loved her back in the right way. Instead, her life ended in the hands of a man who mistook control for care, and that mistake cost the world someone irreplaceable. In the aftermath of Shemaiah's death, the world seemed to pause, stunned, heartbroken, and searching for answers. But while the people who loved her were left to grieve, law enforcement turned its focus to the man responsible. Brian Jackson, the 34-year-old man who had been in a relationship with her, was arrested and taken into custody. There was no mystery about who had committed the crime. He didn't flee. He didn't hide. And the weight of what he'd done was undeniable. The police wasted no time bringing charges against Brian. He was formally accused of murder, specifically second-degree murder, though that charge may evolve as the investigation and prosecution proceed. The language in that courtroom was cold and procedural, but the reality behind it was deeply human. A young girl's life had been stolen, and now the man who took it would have to face justice. As news of the charges spread, the community's outrage grew. For many, this wasn't just about Brian Jackson. It was about a pattern of older men preying on younger women, a pattern of ignored red flags, a pattern of silence until it's too late. In Shemaiah's case, there was no ambiguity, no question about who had caused this tragedy. But even with a clear perpetrator, the legal process still takes time. During his first court appearance, Brian Jackson stood before a judge, shackled, wearing the face of a man who had crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. The courtroom was heavy. Shemaiah's family sat in quiet pain, her mother clutching photos of the daughter she would never hold again. It was a scene too many families know, the start of a legal journey no one ever wants to walk. Prosecutors laid out their initial case, describing a history of controlling behavior and a fatal act of violence. They spoke plainly, but the implications were enormous. This wasn't just a moment of rage. It was the culmination of months, maybe years, of manipulation, jealousy, and unchecked emotional abuse. They made it clear, Shemaiah didn't just die. She was killed. And Brian Jackson was responsible. The defense, meanwhile, did what the defense always does. There were attempts to humanize Brian, to suggest the relationship was complicated. But no amount of legal argument can erase the facts. No version of complicated justifies murder. And for the people who knew Shemaiah, the people who loved her, the attempt to soften Brian's image felt like a second wound. At the time of this writing, Brian Jackson remains in custody. Bond, if it was ever discussed, was likely denied, or set impossibly high. The state sees him for what he is, a danger not just to one person but to the community. The legal process will move forward. Motions will be filed, hearings will be scheduled, and eventually a trial will come. But the real justice will never be enough, because it can't bring Shemaiah back. Still, her family continues to show up. They sit in court. They wear shirts with her face on them. They light candles, speak her name, and demand that the system treats her case with the seriousness it deserves. And more than that, they fight to make sure other young girls don't suffer the same fate. Shemaiah's mother has become a voice, grieving but powerful, a voice that says, "No more silence." Because what happened to Shemaiah wasn't just a crime, it was a failure of society to protect our daughters. A failure to question why a 34-year-old man had access to a vulnerable teenager. A failure to recognize that control and violence often come dressed as love. But now her case stands as a call for accountability, not just in courtrooms but in our communities. Justice in the legal sense will take time. There will be hearings, evidence, and eventually a verdict. But real justice, that comes from change, from speaking out, from recognizing the red flags early, from making sure that Shemaiah's story is not just remembered, but used, to protect, to inform, and to empower those who might otherwise fall into the same deadly trap. The days after Shemaya's death were filled with the kind of pain no family should ever have to endure. Her mother, whose love for Shemaya had always been fierce and unconditional, now faced an unimaginable reality, planning her daughter's funeral instead of celebrating her next milestone. The grief was raw, loud, and consuming. No parent is ever prepared to bury their child, especially not one so full of life and light. At the vigil held in her memory, dozens of people gathered. Friends brought candles. Classmates shared memories. Some stood in silence, others cried openly. The air was thick with heartbreak, but also with unity. Everyone there understood that this wasn't just a private loss. It was a communal wound, one that stretched far beyond her family and deep into the heart of a community that had failed to protect one of its own. Shemaya's family became her voice. Her mother, even through tears, spoke boldly. She demanded answers. She spoke her daughter's name with power. And she urged other young girls to recognize their worth, to walk away from danger before it's too late. In her unimaginable grief, she found purpose, to make sure that no other mother has to stand where she now stands. Friends and loved ones took to social media, sharing memories, photos, and warnings. "She was just a baby," one friend wrote. "She didn't deserve this." Another posted, "If you're in a relationship and something feels off, please say something. Leave if you can. Tell someone. Don't stay quiet." These weren't just tributes. They were pleas. Because Shemaya's story had touched a nerve, and now it was reaching people far beyond her circle. In the community, conversations began to shift. People started speaking more openly about age gap relationships, grooming, and emotional abuse. Shemaya's name became a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of awareness. Schools, churches, and youth programs began talking more directly to young girls and boys about what love should and shouldn't feel like. Out of the pain, something important was beginning to bloom: dialogue, education, and action. Local organizations and domestic violence advocates also stepped in, using Shemaya's story as a rallying cry. Helplines were promoted. Safe spaces were opened. Panels were held to talk about power dynamics and how predators often manipulate young minds. Shemaya's name wasn't fading, it was becoming a lifeline. A reminder that awareness can save lives, that speaking up can break cycles. Though her life was stolen, her impact lives on. Shemaya Nyer Allen is more than a victim. She is a legacy. One that calls us all to pay attention, to protect our girls, and to speak up before it's too late. Shemaya's story, as heartbreaking as it is not an isolated one. Every day, young women, especially Black girls, find themselves caught in dangerous relationships with older, more controlling partners. The age difference is often romanticized or brushed off, but behind those gaps are power imbalances that leave room for manipulation, emotional abuse, and in too many cases, violence. What happened to Shemaya is tragic, but it's also a mirror reflecting a bigger issue we can no longer ignore. Far too often we teach young girls how to love, but we don't always teach them how to recognize when love turns toxic. We tell them to be loyal, to hold on, to forgive, but we don't always empower them to walk away when things feel wrong. And for boys and men, the lessons are just as crucial. Love is not ownership. Jealousy is not affection. Control is not care. We must start raising generations that understand these truths early, before the damage is done. It's also important to talk about silence. Many victims don't speak up, not because they don't want help, but because they fear what will happen if they do. Fear of not being believed. Fear of being blamed. Fear of the abuser retaliating. And so they stay. They hide. They hope. That's why as friends, family, neighbors, and educators, we must learn to listen differently, to notice the signs, to believe survivors when they speak, especially when they're young. Love should never come with bruises, fear, or silence. Real love lets you breathe. Real love lets you grow. Shemaya deserved that. Every girl does. And so we carry her story forward. Not to dwell in sadness, but to protect the ones still here. If Shemaya's voice had been heard sooner, maybe she'd still be here. If one more person had spoken up, intervened, or checked in, Maybe this could have ended differently. Let her story be the lesson. Let it be the light. Because in remembering her, we may save someone else. Shemaya Nair Allen should still be here, laughing with her friends, posting selfies, making plans, living life. Instead, we are left with memories, and a heavy reminder of what happens when love turns dangerous and silence becomes deadly. Her story has become a symbol, not just of tragedy but of truth. And it's a truth we can't afford to ignore. She was only 18, still figuring out who she wanted to be. Still trusting, still open to love, still believing in the best of people. She didn't deserve what happened to her. And while we can't change the past, we can honor her by protecting others who might be in a similar situation right now, feeling scared, confused, or alone. To the young girls watching this, you are worthy of a love that lifts you, not one that controls or belittles you. If someone makes you feel small, scared, or trapped, that is not love. You do not owe anyone your silence. You do not have to stay. And you are never alone even when it feels like it. To the families, friends, and communities, don't wait for screams to check in. Pay attention to the quiet changes. Ask the uncomfortable questions. Step in with love and concern, even if you're not sure what's going on. Your voice could be the lifeline someone is waiting for. We tell these stories not to sensationalize, but to humanize. Shemaya was not just a headline. She was a daughter, a friend, a light. And now she is a voice for others. A warning. Call to action. A reminder that we all have a role to play in stopping abuse before it turns fatal. If you or someone you know is in an unsafe relationship, please don't wait. Reach out. Call a trusted person. Use the resources available in your area. We'll include links and hotlines in the video description. There is always a way out. There is always someone who will listen. By sharing Shemaya's story, we are keeping her memory alive. But more importantly, we are choosing to break the silence. Every share, every comment, every conversation sparked by this video could be the beginning of someone's freedom. Let's not let her name fade away in sorrow. Let it rise as a banner of awareness, strength, and change. If this video touched you, if it made you think, or if it opened your eyes, please like this video. Your support helps us bring more of these important stories to light. It helps the algorithm prioritize truth and advocacy over noise and distraction. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, whether it's a parent, a friend, a teen you care about. These aren't just stories. They're lifelines. And sometimes all it takes is the right message at the right time to save a life. And if you believe in what we're doing, using real stories to spark real change, subscribe to Pearl True Crime Stories. We'll continue to tell stories that matter. Stories that bring justice, hope, and healing. Stories like Shemaya's, because her life mattered. And her story deserves to be told again and again, until change finally comes.